Welcome to the Resilience Report, where each week we share the latest on companies engaging in inspirational solutions for our planet and engage with ecopreneurs and lighthouse leaders disrupting the respective industries in pursuit of better, more resilient business. I'm your host, Florence Scott. Thank you for joining me as we dive into this week's report. This is such a fun episode of the Resilience Report. Almost like you're a fly on the wall at a dinner party with myself and our next two guests, chatting all things sustainability marketing, B2B messaging with a double click into the manufacturing space, website accessibility, and much more. The world of environmental impact is a delicate one, an area that requires an incredible amount of nuance when it comes to storytelling. So who better to join us than two experts in the field of digital marketing and sales, Carman Pirie and Jeff White, co-founders of Kula Partners, an agency built to help leading manufacturers digitally transform marketing and sales to deliver more leads, close more prospects, and grow their competitive edge. Over his nearly 3 decades in marketing and communications, Carman's career has taken him from the halls of Canada's Parliament to various client-side and agency-side marketing leadership roles. Along the way, he has advised Fortune 100 clients, governments, and nonprofit organizations. At Kula Partners, Carman serves as lead marketing and sales counsel to the firm's diverse range of North American manufacturing clients. His unique insights and distaste for the ordinary have earned him a Gold Award for Media Innovation from Marketing Magazine, and Kula Partners, Canada's first platinum HubSpot agency, has been recognized as a top lead generator among HubSpot partners. Jeff is a UX and usability expert, having begun building sites for the web over 25 years ago. He leads the design and development practice at Kula Partners. A number of years ago, Jeff returned to the NSCAD University as a sessional professor, bringing his understanding of web standards to a new generation of design students. A passionate advocate for usability and an open web that is accessible to everyone, Jeff frequently speaks on web design, usability, accessibility, marketing, and sales at events such as HubSpot's Inbound Conference. Carman and Jeff are also the co-hosts of The Kula Ring, a weekly podcast that focuses on talking technology, marketing, and sales with some of the most interesting minds in manufacturing marketing. I actually had the opportunity to chat with them on The Kula Ring, sharing a bit more about my day-to-day work, how I got into the clean tech space, as well as what I see on the horizon for marketers in the environmental space. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do want to hear an extension of our conversation, where the tables are turned and Jeff and Carman interview me, be sure to check out our episode over on the Kula Ring podcast. Well, welcome to the Resilience Report, Jeff and Carman. You're actually our very first duo guests on the show, so welcome to today's episode.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. It really takes two of us to try to keep up, Lauren. That's the secret.
Yeah. It's like 2 brains, 1 actual functioning human. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I'm glad those 2 brains have joined us today. So to start things off, would each of you mind providing a little bit of background and how you got to founding Kula Partners? So kind of your respective journeys to coming together as one.
I'm going to let Jeff go first. Yeah.
Yeah. So we go way back about 20 years now. Founded a design agency that was primarily focused on building accessible sites for the web, and began doing a lot of work in the social media space and that kind of thing. And that's actually, Carman and I met through Twitter in like the very early days of Twitter, kind of like 2007, 2008, and realized we had some complementary skills. And he was working at a larger advertising agency, and I was doing web builds for the strategic campaigns that he was bringing to his clients. And after a time, we realized that we worked pretty well together. And so 2009 decided to join forces and launch the agency called Kula Partners. Do you want to add to some of that, Carman?
Well, I don't have much to add to that, but did you want to talk anything about how you got there before then? Or maybe Lauren doesn't care. I just thought that was part of the question.
I would love to hear all about the journey.
Yeah. I mean, that side is pretty interesting. You know, personally, I went to design school in the 90s when the web was just becoming a thing. And so in my last couple of years there, I really started deep diving on interactive and interface design and all of that kind of stuff, and really found a passion for that. So, began building websites. Geez, what, 1994 was, I think, when I built my first one. It was Netscape was still in beta back then.
Wow.
So it's always just kind of been a passion of mine, and really kind of love the nature. And the web's a very different place today than it was 25, 20, 15 years ago, but it's still a pretty spectacular thing to be able to work within and to bring people together as a result of the platforms you get to build.
Yeah. And look, I don't have any real arguments with Jeff about how Kula Partners came to be. I think that's a nice, clean description of it. How did I end up into that conversation originally, or how did I get there from university or what have you? I'd say interesting maybe to this podcast, Lauren, would be I'm a business grad, but I majored in natural resource and environmental economics. So it was back in the day when there was only something like 200 or 300 published articles in the planet about emissions trading. So I'm very much dating myself now. So I've always been interested in that kind of intersection of business and environment and whatnot. And frankly, I thought marketing, the way it was taught in university, was kind of boring and foolish. And then I started selling television advertising in my last year of university. And that kind of got me into marketing in a different way. And then oddly, I ended up being a chief of staff to a member of parliament here in Canada right out of school, and shifted into politics, which is frankly all about marketing and sales. And then I ran in an election and lost, but nothing gives you great ground game quite like having to go door to door and try to market and sell yourself one door at a time. So that was pretty cool. And then after a bit of a stint in the electric utility space and whatnot, I ended up back in marketing as a director of marketing for a contract furniture company, and then came into the agency space. So it's been a really bizarre, winding road to get here. And I think that Jeff covered from then on through Kula, I think, pretty well.
And to lay the groundwork a little bit for our clients, could you help us understand, without necessarily naming names, what kind of clients you do have with Kula Partners?
Yeah, well, we're specifically an agency that focuses on B2B manufacturers, usually ones that sell things to other manufacturers. And we kind of work within a couple different spheres. Some where we work with billion-dollar plus manufacturers where we do a very small subset of their overall marketing mix. And then others where we're much more full service in that kind of mid-market range kind of thing. So a lot of them are industrials. We have a number of packaging clients, some contract manufacturing companies.
And global industrial automation brands.
Yeah.
We list them all on our website if you all want to go check it out.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to drop their names here.
And then over these last 20 years, pulling it through with the resilience report, have you seen the themes of either environmental design or sustainable impact be woven increasingly into your customers' messaging or even into their overall business practices? Has this been an evolution over the past 20 years? I'd love to know kind of what that trajectory has looked like.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. I think the evolution, I would say, is it seemed to be a lot more picky and choosy of which industries or what sectors were really interested in it or talking about it, and how advanced they were in talking about it. So I mentioned, very early on, I worked in the, contract office furniture space. Well, sustainability conversation in terms of the built environment, the LEED certification of office buildings, things of that sort, that's been around for quite a long time. I mean, I remember, more than 20 years ago, we're selling office chairs that were fully recyclable and on and on. But then, frankly, some of our flexible packaging clients, they've been talking about sustainability for maybe 5-8 years in a meaningful way. And both of the cases that I'm thinking of, they were like the only ones in their space doing so. So, it seems like, so now it's like, it's more universal, but I think people are still at different phases along that path of just kind of recognizing that there's a problem and maybe they're a part of it, to actually being a bit more sophisticated in terms of how they think about it and talk about it.
I think too, part of the problem for a lot of those folks who are thinking about the sustainability message, they're thinking about the environmental footprint of their product and what they create and who they sell to, only really becomes a a thing for their customers when it becomes a thing for their customers' customers.
Absolutely.
So when somebody comes to you and says, if you don't have sustainable packaging, we're no longer going to buy your stuff, all of a sudden they start going to their suppliers of packaging and saying, you guys have that sustainable stuff, right? Like, it's going to be recyclable, right? And now it's all about that.
Yeah, but up until then, the fact that it's 20% more costly is the deal breaker, right? Until that customer starts demanding it. Yeah, so I think you're quite right, Jeff. It does kind of depend on that push-pull of, and when we mentioned the built environment, I mean, a lot of that marketing messaging is kind of served into the architect and design community. They're pretty lefty by general sensibility. It's certainly, environmental considerations very much front and center in their world. So in order to sell into that world, well, I mean, even think about like Interface Carpet. How old is that story, right?
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. So when you're mentioning the worlds of kind of coexisting, of telling that message of sustainability and what companies are doing and advertising, certainly the theme or the concern of greenwashing comes up. Is this something that you're able or need to support your customers? Do they ever come to you with questions around greenwashing considerations? And if so, do you go anywhere to consider, for example, what are the regulations in a Canadian landscape? Or is the B2B market maybe a little bit more sheltered from these conversations, at least for right now?
I would say most customers are really afraid of going near it if they feel like they're going to be greenwashing anything. So the ones that are comfortable talking about it, they have either like, their spec line item detail about their product that they know meets international standards for, sustainability, et cetera. Or they are maybe a member of a industry sustainability council where their overall practices are audited and things of that sort. So they have some things that they can kind of lean on and support their claims. So I find that I don't think I've ever had a client come to me and say, here's a really kind of sneaky greenwashing message. Can I get away with this? It's been more the opposite. It's more like, we start peeling back the stories about what they're actually doing that they're not telling. And we kind of say, guys, like, we can talk about this. Like, the fact that you reduced your electrical consumption in your factory by 40% because of the addition of wind power, this is something we can actually talk about. Like, why aren't we mentioning it?
There's so many that are, as the customer's customer, thing starts to come into play, they realize that our clients' customers are able to incorporate those sustainability components in their overall supply chain green messaging, which of course is part of it. It's not just what comes out of your own factory, but it's about what is coming into that factory beforehand, on the supply chain basis that is pretty important. One of the things that I think is pretty interesting about it, and Carman kind of alluded to this a bit around this idea that, they're stating the spec and the letter of the quality of the product or what have you, as opposed to kind of leading with that message, X% reduction in overall greenhouse gas or whatever. Instead of leading with that, what they're leading with typically, because I think especially in kind of the packaging space, there are concerns that recyclable alternatives are not necessarily as high quality and are going to reflect more poorly on the end product because of that. There's clarity issues or feel issues or printing concerns. So they're focusing more on like, how have they optimized that product in order to achieve or even outpace the competitive products that were not recyclable? How can they meet the same level of standard? How can they, create something that is as good a quality in that space? And so that is often the messaging that they're touting, and then trying to show that it can be had, that pricing conversation frequently comes into it as well. This can't be 40% more expensive just to meet the needs of Walmart, So,
yeah.
Or actually, in that case, maybe it can be, but
yeah.
Certain large end customers can carry a lot of weight in terms.
Indeed.
You do mention this idea of messaging then. So what role do you think marketing and communications people professionals have in terms of sustainability and the value of storytelling as we do transition towards more environmental or socially sound solutions?
Well, I mean, they are the chief storyteller after all, right? So I guess the role becomes one more of making sure that that story has some validation to it and some proof points associated with it. And I mean, we started earlier about asking about different regulations or how people may, and I guess that's one way to stay on the right side of the conversation, is just to go by the letter of the law. I think most marketing communications professionals are pretty okay with leaning in further than that and making sure that they're, let the legal team decide if things are meeting the letter of the law. How are you doing in terms of meeting the spirit of your commitments and the spirit of your corporate values and those that you're wanting to hang your hat on publicly with your investors and key stakeholders, et cetera? And that, I think in most cases, that will be a higher bar to be holding yourself to than the regulatory bar. And I think that's the role of marketing communications. I don't envy it necessarily. It's not an easy one. I think sometimes you can sound like you're having very nuanced, almost non-businessy conversations with CFOs that are like, what does this have to do with making us more money anyway? But I'd like to think in the environmental space, we're getting beyond that kind of back and forth, but maybe not.
And like Kula Partners, I definitely work with a lot of clients in the United States, and certainly the topic of sustainability is, but there are many other topics that can be polarizing, and I would say even politicized, picking on the US, but this could be anywhere. How do you advise your customers from a marketing perspective when they are having to go near a topic that can be a little polarizing? Do you adjust your messaging and approach based on that, or do you almost lean into it? What does that look like from a marketing lens?
I think that's a hard question to answer in some ways. I feel like, because I'm a bit of a political animal, as we mentioned before, so I think it's really hard for me to turn that part of my brain off. So I'm not saying, that makes me better at seeing the potential politicization of something than everybody else. It's not bad. I think almost maybe naturally adjust the messaging or how I think about those things a little bit now I'm trying to think about how that happens,
I think a lot of the time too, Carman, we try, because especially when you're in a really competitive space, as many of our customers are, simply making the same green claims as everybody else is not going to help you differentiate your brand or your product or anything. So, oftentimes what we're trying to do is help our clients use that as a leverage point to get to something different, to have different stories and tell a different story that is backed up by the green claims, but is more about leading with something that is innovative or different or otherwise kind of unique.
And I think whether it's, we think about all the things that can kind of get swept up into a politicized conversation. And my goodness, north of the border here in Canada, we're as susceptible to it these days as they are south of the border. We used to maybe be able to slap ourselves on the back and think we were higher and mightier than that. But man, of late, I'm not so sure. And one thing I have found, whether it's talking about bringing back good paying American manufacturing jobs or, that type of narrative, all of those, whether we're talking about that or sustainability messaging or what have you, one thing I've noticed consistently across the B2B manufacturing landscape is that they're having the conversation at the adult table. And they really view the political conversation as happening at the kids' table, if you will, on this. We're recording this on the American Thanksgiving weekend. I think it's an appropriate analogy. They really do view. But I remember when all that conversation was going on about bringing back American manufacturing jobs, and then everybody we were talking to that is really knowledgeable in the space, labor force economists based in Washington, D.C., directors of human resources for multi-billion-dollar manufacturers, and they're like, yeah, those jobs aren't coming back the way the politicians are talking about. That's not the way things even get made now. but they have to in some way tolerate that narrative happens while still pushing forward with the real conversation. I'm not that sure that's that dissimilar than what happens when there's a politicization around climate change or whatever. The businesses themselves know we need to keep pushing forward on what we're doing here. We can't get distracted by that.
Yeah, and I mean, that reshoring or nearshoring thing, especially as it relates to the manufacturing thing, certainly has a sustainability message, but it also has an inherent political message, looking to get things out of China and bring more of that supply chain back to North America, or even, India, it's closer than China and a different type of partner than maybe the Chinese are seen as. But, that kind of thing, like Carman said, it's not about bringing back a bunch of blue collar jobs, even though that's what the politicians are talking about. It's more about, stabilizing supply chains, cutting down on shipping costs. That's become an absolutely enormous component of a lot of these supply chains. Bringing things over from China isn't necessarily as inexpensive as it used to be. So, that has a sustainability component, but it's probably talked about more from the supply chain perspective.
And certainly, as we're all becoming more international in our business practices, I'm sure some of the lines are being blurred. But do you see a difference at all in terms of marketing messaging from geography to geography? Like even within Canada, are there different approaches on marketing messaging? Or are we all kind of becoming slightly homogenized because we do have access to content from around the world?
I mean, an awful lot of, I really can't think of a client that I've worked with of late that's really customizing their messaging on a per Canadian region basis.
Other than maybe Quebec.
Other than that, potentially. Yeah. But there's, because often even Canada is seen as a rounding error to the United States for many of or just kind of an add-on, for better or worse. But I do think that we do notice a difference in that messaging between Europe and the US. There's no question about that. The more it's included, the more it's an of course. It's not as politicized in Europe. It's just much more assumed. I think there's certainly those differences. I think we can, in Canada, it does tend to probably follow the political lines. If anybody is, it's not, I don't want to, our good friends out in BC tend to be maybe a little bit more lefty on these issues, whereas you may not want to beat that drum a whole lot in Alberta. I don't know. Some good environmentalists in Alberta, though. I don't want to get on the bad side of them.
There certainly are. Okay, so maybe some nuances, but
we see nuances between North America and Europe, but I don't think that this, gets any really much more nuanced than that.
I do think it makes, just to toot our own horn a little bit, we do get an awful lot of interest from European companies who see Canada as the gateway drug to the US, and our knowledge and understanding of the American manufacturing market is attractive to a lot of, German and Dutch and Finnish companies that we've worked with over the years that have come to us to help them kind of create a beachhead into North America. Just because we can talk the talk a bit more, and they sort of feel like they don't necessarily have that edge.
And beyond your experience that you're bringing in, obviously from Kula Partners, you've also had the opportunity to speak with a number of different experts throughout the years, because you also host a podcast called The Kula Ring. Would you mind sharing a little bit about how the idea came about developing a podcast? Because this was a little while ago too, and maybe it was less mainstream for us all to have a podcast. So I would love to hear how that came about and how that's evolved over the years.
Yeah, I mean, when we, as we we're really narrowing the focus of the firm to work exclusively with manufacturers. It's been a number of years ago now. Frankly, the conversation around B2B marketing seemed to not really include manufacturers at all. It was mostly B2B SaaS, frankly, dominating the conversation. And we just, Jeff and I were talking there. We're like, really, nobody's telling the stories of manufacturing marketers. And frankly, industrial, when people talk about industrial marketers, they almost immediately assume that means backwards. Do they even have a website yet? There's almost a bit of a pejorative tone to it and we were, we're working with and encountering all of these marketers in the manufacturing space that were doing amazing things, doing great work, frankly outpacing their B2C counterparts who are always the big shiny objects in marketing. And we just want to tell the stories of these people. Let's shine a light on it. And we thought the more we could do that selfishly, the more we would learn. Because we can interview 52 really smart people a year with a weekly podcast, and it's a really great excuse to have a conversation. So that's what brought it about.
And you've had, I believe, somewhere over 250 episodes at this point. We were talking earlier as to whether you've seen the sustainability message be woven increasingly in your customers' messaging. And what about your guests on the podcast? Is this a theme or a topic that does come up from time to time? And is that increasingly so?
It definitely does come up. I would say it's been more of late, wouldn't you say, Jeff?
It certainly feels that way. That could just be the guest that we've had on.
Yeah.
Because we do tend to, recruit through, different industry categories. So sometimes we get a bit of a run of things. But we've had some really interesting kind of sustainability and green stories on recently. A number of them in the packaging space, but also some others too. Just thinking about things from a very different perspective.
Yeah. And I would say at the start when we were doing our podcast, it would be sustainability as one thing. Now it's also ESG more broadly being talked about. So, and I think sustainability initiatives are getting more specific in nature. So we're getting further away from talking about, warm and fuzzy commitments to more specific things that we're actually doing.
Mm-hmm. And through all of that, are you seeing any specific opportunities or risks arising? If we have other listeners who are tuning in who are maybe B2B marketers, is there anything that you're seeing as common themes that maybe they should go look into, or anything that they should avoid based on what you've heard from your guests?
Well, we had a very smart guest on the podcast recently talking about some evolving standards in the U.S. that were coming up.
Yes, there will be a nice little podcast swap coming up, so you will be able to check me out on Kula as well. But other than that guest, I did hear a couple of people on previous episodes who were maybe talking a little bit about, it sounds like they are having an increasing role to maybe counter some arguments for some of the solutions that they're having. I think there was one packaging person who was on and said that there is a little bit of resistance towards, for example, plastic packaging. But he was saying then at the same time, for if you take an industry like the food industry, certain packaging actually helps make it more shelf stable. So that it was really nuanced, actually, quite a detailed conversation that he had on that one.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know if I would say that a common theme. It certainly is in packaging, but it's a pretty specific category, but it does, I think, point to a risk. Is I think a lot of manufacturers, when they are starting to talk about their sustainability initiatives and commitments, they do tend to be fairly multifaceted in nature. There's supply chain initiatives, there's product design initiatives, there's even employee commuting and parking or whatever. It's a big thing. And then they often work in categories that get pointed at as being like just the problem. And packaging is a really great example of that. It's really easy to show a trash heap landfill with plastic bags and whatnot blowing across the camera. And plastic's bad. And the really good example of that is the discussion about the plastic in the oceans and the documentaries that have been done about that. It's a very easy story to tell as to why that's bad. The story that you're telling about what you're doing to get better, or the story that you tell about, look, it doesn't, it's actually better for the environment for us to ship plastic versus heavy glass. And the total environmental impact, if we were to actually remove plastic from this supply chain, we would actually be hurting the planet. Those are, to your point, very nuanced conversations. There's a lot, and I just feel it's a real risk, because anytime you have a nuanced message against a simple one, The simple one has a good chance of winning, right? But we are seeing people in that space standing up for themselves a little more and being willing to say, you know what, we are working on this and this is what we're doing. And we know it's complicated to talk about. But we're going to tell you anyway. And by the way, we're also lobbying congressmen and members of parliament or what have you in order to make them understand this as well, so that these kind of symbolic like single-use plastic bag bans or something like that. I say they're purely symbolic, of course, but that the agenda isn't just purely controlled by that. So I've been surprised at some of that, because frankly, I would have said a couple of years ago, I don't know that people would have been willing to stick their neck out and have that conversation.
I think to not do so potentially is fatal.
Yeah. Well, I remember talking to one packaging company, and I asked them, I mean, the massive American packaging company, and asked them what they were doing from a sustainability perspective, because there was no talk about it. It's all on the website. And they're like, yeah, we're letting other people fight that battle. We're doing a bunch of stuff. They were happy to tell me what they were doing, but we're not fighting that battle. We're focused over here. And it's like that seemed to be, so I'm just, I guess when I contrast that to seeing people more of late sticking their necks out, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, to see that evolution. And it's challenging too, because oftentimes if you're advertising, you have such a tiny little window of text or visuals or whatever you can include. And it's a more nuanced conversation. I mean, when I was listening to that very episode on your show at first, my brain went, I don't agree with this person. But then as the individual is speaking, it is absolutely necessary to have that long form conversation, because I could definitely see both sides of it and understand that it is way more nuanced than just that visual story. There's actually a very calculated, more environmental impact methodology that you could also look at. So I love that you have the podcast, because I think it does require that long form conversation for topics that are so complex.
I mean, you just think about like the frozen food category, and how that intersects with food waste, and the fact that we need more food to feed the people on this planet, and how much it costs to ship food, and it just starts to show the complexity of the issue.
Absolutely. And are the two of you, it could be with the podcast or the agency, are you working on any projects in particular right now that you're really excited about that you can share publicly?
Yes and no. I'm really excited about it. I can't think of the ones that I'm really excited about. The NDAs are pretty strict. I don't know. And we tend not to be out in front of our clients. We let our clients be in front of us.
That is fair. And as a marketer, I can appreciate that.
It's also a really political way to play that, Carman.
Yes, every once in a while, having the ex-political hack on staff helps,
Well, actually, to that very point, so you do have a political background. Maybe I'd be very curious just to begin with, what did that background lend to your role in marketing? Because you were mentioning basically every good politician is good at sales and marketing. I would love to know how that has translated over. And then specifically, maybe we can see how would that translate over in terms of talking about a sensitive topic like sustainability and ESG?
I'll try to answer at least part of that. All the politics is marketing, and you're marketing to, we all hate it as marketers, right? Especially agency side people, when they ask a new client, like, who are we trying to sell to? And they say, everybody. And
the only objection is price.
And our target market is everybody. And you're like, no, it can't possibly be. But oddly enough, everybody kind of over 18 and even a little younger than that, because they influence their parents, kind of is who you're selling to. So it's a kind of a raw kind of version of marketing and sales in some way. And of course, I'm from this really, really small part of Canada called New Brunswick, which nobody's really ever heard about, but they've driven through maybe. And it gets made fun of a lot in Canada, and nobody in the US certainly knows about it. But I happen to love it there. But it's, politics in rural New Brunswick, especially when I was doing it, was a kind of a bit of a blood sport. And it was a bit of that time between old school and new school, where it still wasn't an internet game. It still wasn't digital. It was a bit more about the road signs on the doors or on the sides of the road, and the doors you knock on and the families you convince to support you. So I just thought there was a there's always just been a rawness to that marketing and sales exposure that I've always found a lot of parallels to over the years. I don't know how that really translates into marketing of environmental or sustainability topics or sensitivities. I will say, when you are in that space, you do find yourself having to have sensitive conversations with people who aren't interested in having a particularly nuanced dialogue. I could think of it at the time. The one that was really heavy when I ran, because I ran in an election in 1999 at the young age of 23 and lost by 200 and some odd votes.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. What an experience, though.
Exactly. Yeah. And so the conversation then a lot was around immigration. And I'm in a very rural part of New Brunswick. And the conversation, if you wanted to go around saying immigrants are coming in stealing our jobs, there was all kinds of interest in that message. Like anybody would have believed that. It would have been the easy message for me to sell. So when somebody's taking you to task on a topic that sensitive, and you have to kind of actually, you're trying to have an intelligent conversation back to them and talk about the nuances of it and how Canada that doesn't actually let anybody into the country that isn't almost pretty much independently wealthy before they show up. That's been a bit different now with some of the refugee flows of late, but that's not, that wasn't the case back in the day, right? That's again, it was a nuanced conversation you're trying to have in an environment that's more suited to more simplified discussions. So I think that's helped. It's probably made me think about those differences a little bit more. I don't know if it's given me a playbook that I could communicate on this podcast that people could lean on, however.
Well, I definitely think that nuance is so key, and just taking a step back and kind of calmly reflecting as well is such an important part of it, and hearing both sides. Continuing on the theme of sustainability, I learned a lot more about one piece, I think, of sustainability I hadn't thought of was just maybe more on the social side, which was accessibility of websites. So I also had sat on the board of directors for Sierra Club Canada for 6 years, and we were working with a developer who was helping us think of all the environmental and social considerations of our website. And they highlighted the impact of making the website more accessible and making it more, I guess, socially conscious as a platform. And so, Jeff, this is an area that you have a background in as well. Could you speak a little bit more to that concept? Because it was completely new to me, but now that I've had a bit of exposure to it, it absolutely makes sense that we do want to make websites more accessible.
Absolutely. And this is a particular area of focus of mine. It's been that way for a really long time. As you mentioned, there are, depending on where you are, if you're in Ontario in Canada, there's the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the OADA. There is something called Section 508 in the US, and a number of other pieces of legislation that actually require any web platform or digital communication platform, so it could be an app or things like that, that interacts with the public must be accessible to everyone, basically, no matter how they choose to access it. So, most of us who have good sight and good hearing and good mobility and dexterity are able to browse with a computer or a touchpad or things like that and kind of access these platforms. But if you're blind, for example, you might actually use a screen reader that speaks to you, but you have to be able to navigate that. And you might do so with a keyboard. You might do so with a braille reader. You might do so with your iPhone. Actually has all kinds of really interesting assistive technology built in. And in order for those disabled people, which depending on where you're talking about, could be anywhere between 13 and 25% of the population. So, if you're thinking about our customers, our clients' customers, there's most definitely, at least 10 to 20% of the people they're dealing with have some form of disability impacting their ability to access the web. So if you don't code in a certain way and you don't consider these things as you're putting something together, then you potentially create a massive roadblock for people. And that may be as simple as not being able to listen to this podcast. But if you are deaf, maybe you can read the transcript instead, which is why you provide transcripts. It's why we provide transcripts, different alternatives of media, depending on how people are going to access things. So this sort of idea of universal access, like, having a ramp into your restaurant and accessibly wide doors so that wheelchairs can get through to go to the bathroom and things like that. Those are all part of the same concept. but there are guidelines for this. And we really focus on ensuring that all of the platforms that we build and the people that we advise are implementing they're called the WCAG guidelines, WCAG guidelines. And we're in version 2.2 now. It's something that is kind of argued over by a committee of designers and developers and communication professionals around the world, and kind of these standards are implemented that way. And I became particularly interested in this. I have a daughter who's 20, or going to be 20. Actually, this company was founded a week after she was born.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I got laid off and decided I didn't want to work for anybody else. So, but she, when she was little, she had a ton of ear issues, and it got to the point where she had, I believe, 9 surgeries on her ears in about 3 years. And it was pretty clear that she was going to completely lose the hearing in one ear and potentially lose part of her hearing in another ear. And it just really crystallized for me the importance of ensuring that the things that we create for people, are actually available to anybody, no matter how they consume them, no matter what they're going to face personally, that we shouldn't stand in their way of helping them understand products or helping them, utilize the web or access services and things like that. And I will say, thankfully, there was one later surgery that we realized that she wouldn't actually lose her hearing, which was quite wonderful. Now she just pretends she can't hear me. So that's a very different conversation.
Selective.
Yeah, absolutely. So. But it really, kind of experiencing that firsthand and sort of seeing the things that could stand in their way really cements why this is a super important thing to make sure everything's accessible to everybody.
We actually have quite a few of our listeners who are entrepreneurs. So would that be a first place for them to go check out, would be those guides if they've just created, I think a lot of people have their own WordPress websites, that sort of thing. And if they're just trying to become more aware of what they can do, would that be the best starting point?
I think that they may find that a little opaque, but if you do Google kind of an accessibility checker or something like that, you can usually run your website URL through them, and they'll tell you where some of the problems might lie. And then a lot of the WordPress templates have this baked in now. It's a much more common thing than it was 10 years ago, and certainly WordPress is starting from a very good place when it comes to having accessible sites, but usually those kind of online systems will test it and tell you where the problem areas might be, and then you can bring that to your web partner and have them implement them. And
if it's for entrepreneurs that maybe aren't doing them with a web partner, it'll at least let you know the most offensive things that might be taking place that you might need to fix. Quite often it's just simply like people aren't putting alt text on images correctly, or they're just like kind of easy fixes, or there's just kind of something they've done foolishly around contrast because their eyes are fine, so they don't think that it's a contrast issue, but it may fail accessibility guidelines. So there often are just easier fixes, I think, for those types of listeners that are thinking, what's going on? Maybe I should be a little concerned about that. And then on the other side of it is, if you have corporate listeners that are listening in on this, I would just say, like, don't dismiss it. It's like, there's not one damn company out there that would get in an argument with you about having an accessible entrance to their main office or disable parking spots or what have you. They wouldn't even think twice about it. But then the minute you talk to them about spending an extra $10,000 on their website because it should be accessible to everybody, they start to balk. And Jeff has done that. We kind of late in the podcast to bring this up, but we own a second agency called What We Make It, which does service design for governments and public sector. So, and that's where, of course, if you're designing digital services to be deployed to a citizen population, accessibility is even more critical. And some of the accessibility testing that Jeff has led in that space, I really wish people could see it and see what other people have to experience. And then they wouldn't be complaining about the extra money on a website to make it accessible. That's for sure.
Oh, and to see the joy when somebody using one of those devices is just, this is exactly how it's supposed to work. I can get everywhere. I understand where I am. It all makes sense.
Yeah.
The same kind of thing that we all experience, but generally when we access the web, it's not always there.
It's not. Weird parallel to social media. It's easier to be an arsehole to somebody on social media or what have you, because it's nameless, faceless, and you can just rage tweet or whatever, or rage X or whatever they call it, post. I don't know. Anyway, probably the same thing. I think it's not that these people are bad people. It's just that it's they don't have to see the impact of their decision as much.
Yeah.
Well, and often it's coming from a place of ignorance. It's not necessarily that they're choosing to block people out. They just don't even know it's a thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, often you hear in the corporate world that you call your website your front door to your business. But that's why I love that analogy that you had of the ramp, the entrance ramp, because if you don't have that entrance ramp to the front door of your business, you're absolutely right that you're going to be, and it's a business decision too. You're going to be limiting yourself from this whole other customer base. So it's fascinating. I feel like we could do a whole other podcast on that topic alone. Maybe one very selfish question. As a relatively new podcaster, what advice would the two of you have to have that longevity in this space? What has kept you guys coming back week after week with over 250 episodes at this point?
I would say pick a format that works for you. So there are some things about Jeff and I's personality that, as we thought about the format of the show, so as an example, it's not really in our nature to do a lot of advanced prep for something. Like if we, as we started down the road, like if we have to draft questions for 5 hours before every podcast, we're going to do 3 episodes and we're going to shut it down because we're going to be, there's something else to do. There's something else that needs to get done. We don't have time to do that right now. So the format of our show and the way we kind of streamline guests in the process, do discovery calls and understand what makes them tick and then turn that into a show has been kind of built around, it's a format that we built that kind of works for us and has enabled pretty rapid content production. And that's not going to be the same format for everybody. It's not going to work the same for everybody. And so I say find a format that works for your particular personality and lean into it is probably the best thing from a longevity perspective.
Yeah, if you can make it easy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
easy. Put easy in air quotes. Maybe this should be one of the video clips.
Yeah, exactly. Make it repeatable. To that point too. You probably know this as well. The heaviest lift for doing anything like this is recruitment of guests, and there's all kinds of people out there who will find you on LinkedIn once they hear you have a podcast and offer to help build your guest list and all of that. And I think you really do need to have some kind of strategy to do that. Rich Caldwell, that is our podcast producer at Kula, is also our guest recruiter. I believe that's how we found you. And he is phenomenal at filling our pipeline full of wonderful and talented people for us to chat with and have this very easy experience for us. But we used to do that work ourselves, both in person, that was insane, and virtually kind of recruiting. And we were able to hone that process, just like we honed kind of how we produce the podcast, and teach Rich and some other people over the years how to do that for us and just ensure that we're constantly having a good roster of people to speak with. Because otherwise, if you have an interview style podcast, you live and die by a good quantity of guests or good quality.
And if our listeners want to check out the podcast and Kula Partners, where would be the best places for them to go do so?
That would be kulapartners.com and /the Kula ring if you want to get directly to the podcast. But it's also the first nav item.
Well, thank you both so much for joining. We do like to end every episode with the same question, which is, what do you think it will take for businesses and leaders to be resilient going forward?
Wads of cash. No.
That probably helps.
It's weird because, like, the minute you start blending these things, you could easily sound like a conspiracy theorist, and I don't want to get there. But you say about uncertain times, and of course, part of what you're saying there, there's the climate change component to that is obviously massive, and then the political environment that seems to be just unfolding almost regardless of jurisdiction. I mean, it's easy for Canadians up here to make fun of our American friends, but I mean, man, it's not just there, as we talked about before. And I kind of wonder how much longer we can ignore it. Like, I feel like in some ways businesses and leaders have have been able, as I mentioned before, like, okay, we're at the adult table, we're at the kid table, but once all the food ends up on your lap, I'm not sure it matters. Like, somebody needs to deal with it. So I guess I would just say, I think maybe what they're going to need for resilience is maybe an openness to reimagining how they engage with the world and how broad their engagement with the world is. I know it's a really broad answer, but
I love that. And cash. So
yeah, hopefully the cash comes out of that, from having that broad perspective. But I think to that point, an awful lot of us could do well with listening more and asking questions and not assuming we have the answers. Really being considerate of the things we hear and then processing that and trying to understand how to leverage what you've learned. There's no question, better off with the input of others.
Well, thank you for leading with that curiosity with your podcast and certainly with your clients. And thank you for joining us today on the Resilience Report. Really been fun speaking with both of you. So thank you.
Lauren, I hope we haven't ruined your experience for bringing two guests onto the show at once. And it's been wonderful to join you.
Yeah, first and last double guest,
We'll see. We'll see. Time will tell. I hope that you've enjoyed this week's edition of the Resilience Report. If you would like to hear and see more, be sure to check out @The Resilience Report on YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Until we connect again, remember, even on the darkest of days, we all have the opportunity to be a lighthouse for others as we collectively pursue better, more resilient business.